It began not with thunder, but with paperwork, ink drying in London, decisions made an ocean away. Benjamin Franklin had crossed that ocean himself. He arrived in London weary, sharp-eyed, and already angry. "My dear child, we arrived here well last night. Billy is with me. My love to all." His letter sounded calm, but the man who wrote it was walking into a fight. The Pennsylvania Assembly had sent him to argue against the proprietors, landlords who wanted their estates exempt from tax, while the frontier bled and burned. The proprietaries have enjoined their deputy to refuse his assent to any law for raising money by a tax unless their estates be exempted. This appears both unjust and cruel. In London, Franklin found himself facing smiles polished to perfection. He met the Earl of Granville, who looked down over his teacup and said, "You Americans have wrong ideas of the nature of your constitution. The king is the legislator of the colonies." That was the moment Franklin later said he understood the truth, that the colonies were not partners in empire, they were property. Back in Pennsylvania, merchants cursed quietly behind closed doors. War had changed everything. The rule of 1756 strangled trade. Neutral ships stopped, goods seized, profits turned to risk. A merchant wrote, "Almost every vessel bound up the straits fell into the hands of the French." And as the seas closed, the prices rose. Wheat, salt, and cloth cost double what they had a year ago. Farmers who had once bartered freely now carried muskets when they went to market. A diary from Long Island spoke plain truth. "I have not had 1 minute's rest today. Very cold with a northwest wind that blows the snow all day. I am tired almost to death." The war was supposed to be fought in the forests, but by 1757 it had reached every kitchen, every ledger, every field. Franklin, writing from London, began to see the colonies differently, as a people tested by distance and disregard. He had come to argue for fairness, but fairness was not for sale in London. Back in Virginia, George Washington still carried the burden left by Braddock's ghost. "Can't conceive that being Americans should deprive us of the benefits of British subjects. We are defending the king's dominions." But there were no reinforcements, no gold, no thanks, only orders. The spring rains came again, and the frontier turned into a battlefield built from mud, hunger, and fear. The colonies had entered the year believing the worst had passed. They were wrong. Spring did not bring renewal in 1757. It brought realization that Britain's war was now their own, and no one would save them from it. By midsummer, the colonies were out of patience and out of luck. The war had grown teeth. It bit into every trade route, every harvest, every border. In New York and the northern colonies, the French moved fast, sharper, smarter, and far more ruthless. Their Indian allies swept through the forests like shadows, and every messenger that left a fort was one arrow away from vanishing. And then came Fort William Henry. For 6 days in August, the sky over the fort stayed black with smoke. Inside, the British fought without hope. The French under Montcalm surrounded them, thousands strong. When the white flag rose, it wasn't victory, it was exhaustion. Montcalm agreed to spare the survivors, to escort them out, but promises die quickly in the woods. The retreat turned to massacre, confusion, rage, betrayal, and the survivors who reached Albany told stories no one wanted to believe. Later, Montcalm wrote letters to apologize. On 14th August, I have written to Loudoun and Webb to apologize for the behavior of the Indians, but also to justify it. He couldn't explain it. No one could. The frontier was no longer a war. It was a storm of vengeance. Across the colonies, fear became currency. Merchants locked their ledgers and watched prices climb like smoke. Shortages drove up English prices in 1757, and North American wheat partially answered that demand. Farmers in Pennsylvania shipped what little grain they had to the ports, hoping to profit before the French burned the roads behind them. Others hoarded, trading bushels for bullets instead of coin. A Quaker merchant in Philadelphia refused to arm the militia. His wagons were burned in the night. He wrote nothing. There was nothing left to write. In Virginia, Washington's men were half-fed, half-clothed, and half-mad. Lenity, so far from producing its desired effects, rather emboldens them. In short, they tire my patience, and almost weary me to death. He wrote that their total strength amounted to 699. 699 to guard 1,000 miles of fear. Even in the towns, no one felt safe. Rumors ran faster than couriers. French fleets spotted off the coast. Indian raids within days' ride. Every stranger on the road looked like a warning, and yet life refused to stop. Children were born. Wheat was threshed. Letters were sent. Mary Cooper, a farmer's wife on Long Island, wrote in her diary, "Very cold with a northwest wind that blows the snow all day. I am tired almost to death." Her words were ordinary, but in them was the sound of the war's real front. The home, the hearth, the quiet collapse of hope. By August's end, the colonies had learned something terrible. That courage didn't always look like battle. Sometimes it looked like living through the day. And the people who survived 1757 did not cheer for victory. They only waited for the next blow. Autumn brought no harvest worth boasting about. The fields were thin, the granaries half empty, and the promises thinner still. In Philadelphia, letters from London arrived too slowly to matter. The assembly argued over taxes, uniforms, and pride, while outside the State House, men argued over bread. Benjamin Franklin wrote again, his tone colder now. "The proprietaries have enjoined their deputy to refuse his assent to any law for raising money by a tax unless the greatest part of their estate is exempted. This appears both unjust and cruel." But London's reply came like ice water. "You Americans," said the Earl of Granville, "have wrong ideas of your constitution. The king is the legislator of the colonies." Franklin stopped writing about compromise. He began writing about consequences. Across the sea, William Pitt took power and promised salvation. He told Parliament, "I am sure I can save this country, and nobody else can." And perhaps he believed it, but Pitt's salvation had a price. He needed ships, soldiers, and silver, and he would find it in the colonies. Orders arrived. More troops, more food, more supply. And for the first time, the colonists began to ask, "When does this war stop being Britain's?" In taverns, men spoke louder. Rum carried courage where letters could not. Prices rose again. A loaf of bread cost what a week's wages once did. Coal for the winter doubled. Woman in Boston wrote that her children were pale and hollow-eyed, but we are thankful for each day. Merchants fought quietly, one side trading with the army, the other hiding their goods to sell later when desperation paid better. And in Virginia, Washington wrote to the governor with a voice worn thin. Continuing in a service precarious and uncertain tends to promote languor and indifference. It is nipping in the bud our rising hopes. He commanded ghosts, a regiment of men so few they could not guard a single frontier line without fear of vanishing in the night. By November, snow fell on blood that would not freeze. Fort ruins dotted the wilderness like open graves. Families fled south, wagons packed with what the war hadn't already stolen. One journal from Maryland read, "Our cattle thin, our hearts thinner. None speak of peace anymore." Franklin's letters crossed that same ocean, but even his words could not reach home faster than the fear. The empire had begun to crack, not in battlefields or courts, but in kitchens, quarries, and mines. Winter came early in 1757, cold without mercy. Snow crept through cracks in cabins and forts alike, and even the rivers seemed tired of moving. Mary Cooper wrote again from Long Island, "Cold still. My fingers stiff with washing and milking. I pray for fair weather and find none. Her voice could have been any woman's. Across the colonies, wives counted days between letters, and mothers learned to stop asking where their sons had gone. In Virginia, Washington's men burned furniture for heat. Their boots split open. Powder. Wet. Tempers worse. He wrote, "Our total strength amounted to 699, and he didn't need to say how many would still be standing when spring came." The frontier fell silent. Not peace, just exhaustion. Even the enemy seemed too tired to keep killing. In London, Franklin's breath frosted against narrow windows. He had become more diplomat than scientist now, more fighter than philosopher. He read the British papers, each one calling the war necessary, glorious, inevitable. But the colonies were paying the bill. He began to see that no argument could bend the shape of empire, only break it. He wrote home less often that winter. When he did, his letters were brief, signed not with hope, but with duty. By December, William Pitt's orders reached the UHA governors. More men, more money, more exertion. The colonies would have to bleed again for the king's ambition. And yet, something had shifted. Behind the hunger, beneath the fear, there was now anger, a quiet, steady kind of anger, the kind that outlasts generals and winters alike. In response to William Pitt's letter of December 30th, 1757, urging the colonies to increase their exertions, the Assembly wrote back, cautious but not obedient. They were beginning to understand something dangerous, that obedience was a habit, not a law. The year ended not with triumph, but with a whisper that sounded a lot like prophecy. They thought the colonies weak, Franklin would later say, but weakness can turn to patience, and patience can turn to power.